Hello and welcome to a revision video looking at whether the Nazis succeeded in keeping morale high during World War II, or 1939 to 45. And the question is, the Nazis succeeded in keeping morale high, how far do you agree? I am going to argue for the purposes of this video that I disagree to a fair extent, and that I think the Nazis didn't really succeed in keeping morale high. In particular, the key turning point where morale drops is around the end of 1942 and the start of 1943, at the same time, really, as the loss at the Battle of Stalingrad. One of the best pieces of evidence we have that the Nazis were not successful in keeping morale high comes from looking at elites, although it has to be acknowledged that many of the groups that we're going to talk about in elites actually already opposed to the Nazis and what they stood for before the war began, so perhaps in that way actually the war doesn't have a huge impact on what they have to say. The main group is the Kreisau Circle, and that included people like Bonhoeffer, the SPD, leaders and lawyers and aristocrats like von Moltke, who's a kind of key person who allowed the Kreisau Circle to meet at his house. And that group was very anti-Nazis for a number of different reasons. Political, moral, anti the Nazis in many different ways. They only actually had 3 meetings in 1942 to 43, which makes them sound really insignificant. But to prove the level of threat that they caused the Nazis, or the level of low morale that they had, they were so unhappy with the way the Nazis were running the war and the country in general that they attempted to bomb Hitler's plane in 1943, although the bomb didn't actually go off. And in July 1944, there's another attempt to bomb and kill Hitler at his headquarters, which is called Operation Valkyrie. Well, Operation Valkyrie was the idea that they would kill Hitler and then overthrow him, and then they would replace him, and hopefully peace could be negotiated with the British or with the other allies. It didn't work. Unfortunately, Hitler was only injured, so they were unsuccessful. And Hitler made a broadcast to prove that he was alive, and it stopped any kind of further coup or any other people trying to overthrow him at that point. And 5,746 people were executed, and the army was put under SS control, etc., etc., etc. So the Kreisau Circle was very unsuccessful in their aims at trying to overthrow Hitler. However, the point is that they existed, and that they took some very serious action against the Nazis, which proves that there were people who disliked the Nazis and what they stood for during World War II. And in that way, certainly these elites did not have high morale at any point throughout 1939 to 45. However, there is a limitation to this argument. Like I mentioned before, some of these elites, like the SPD, didn't like the Nazis and what they stood for before the war, and in that way their attitudes and their morale towards the group who was ruling them hasn't changed significantly during the war. And it's worth noting that the elites made the mistake of not really attempting to gain any popular support for their cause, so they didn't use radios or anything like that to alert people to what they were doing or trying to do. And many ordinary people actually saw the elites, like the Kreisau Circle, and what Operation Valkyrie stood for, as being traitorous, and disliked it. So at the beginning of the war, actually quite a few people, and even as far through as 1943, there were enough people who still saw what these people were doing as evil and supported the Nazis. In terms of a group of people who were most significantly impacted by World War II, and their lives changed, and it caused them to feel much more negatively, and their morale dropped, it's probably women. And that's partly because they were impacted in a way more than other people were by the war. So they were the ones who had to queue daily for food rations, and they saw food shortages and things like that firsthand. They were impacted in quite a big way when men were being conscripted for work elsewhere in factories, or for fighting on the battlefronts, and they're caring for the children whilst they're away. Women did increasingly get pulled into work. At the beginning of the war, they were less impacted, and their morale was probably slightly higher, and that's probably because at the beginning of the war, when Blitzkrieg was happening, Lightning War, and they had lots of really quick victories, they were able to exploit newly occupied areas for supplies, so there weren't really any serious food shortages in terms of they weren't life-threatening in any way. There was discontent for women, things like soap and washing powder and shoes and coal for burning in your fires. Those things there were shortages of in 1939 to 41, and that would have been unpleasant, and it would have slightly dented morale. But initially, women kind of benefited, and the number of women in work actually decreased 1939 to 41. Hitler refused to encourage women into work because it went against his ideology, and only 250,000 women were conscripted, and they were all unmarried women. Some women actually benefited in the early war period. So pregnant mothers, for example, were given extra rations and things like that. Obviously, not everyone did. So some Jewish women, for example, would have been given reduced rations. People in the countryside would be able to grow their own food, but there were shortages of fuel and animal feed and tools and things like that. So women, even in the countryside, did suffer and did struggle to get by. As time went on, obviously, conscription had to be started, and in particular, like I've mentioned, really the key time to be looking at is 1943 onwards. 1943 is a massive turning point. In 1943, luckily for remembering purposes, 43 cities were bombed across Germany. We know obviously there was bombing going on before this, but this is when the USA joins forces and gets involved, and the bombing is more accurate than it had been initially in 1942, when only 1 in 3 targets was actually hit by the Allies. And there were lots of reports about the bombings that suggested that actually, you know, women and other workers, their morale stayed high and they were great and calm and dealt with the situation. But in reality, those reports were made to celebrate things. So even the SPD and SEPAID reports, which you might expect to be more truthful in some way, actually were celebrating workers. And so kind of really focus on the key role that the workers were playing in keeping the country going, when in actual fact, lots of first-hand accounts suggest that morale was really low. You know, children were being killed, family members were being killed. And in addition to that, in 1943, there's the real shock of the defeat of the Battle of Stalingrad. Goebbels had been telling everyone through propaganda continuously at home, women in particular, that they were winning the war, and you know they're all fighting this fantastic battle, and Hitler was some kind of military genius, and basically propaganda was really dented, and people didn't really trust it so much after 1943, when they realised that actually they're significantly losing the war and they're constantly retreating and that kind of thing. So women at home were less likely to accept propaganda after that point. And we also see a change in 1943 because Goebbels, Goering declares total war. In 1943, we see women being conscripted into, it's auxiliary, so they're not actually combatants, they're not fighting, but they're being conscripted into the armed forces. So they're looking after anti-aircraft guns, they're kind of maintaining them. They're being in charge of the phone lines and communications on radios and things like that. And towards the very end of the war, in 1945, there were actually even some women's battalions that were trained for combatant roles as well. So I think we could say for women, although at the beginning of the war, the morale isn't hugely dented, it does start to lower, and that's because they are facing shortages. Even though they're not life-threatening, it would have bruised their morale a little bit. 1943 onwards, really women are significantly impacted by World War II. And they're less trusting of the government, and the benefits that many women had at the beginning of the war are gone, and morale really does start to drop quite rapidly for women. Again, for workers, their morale, similarly to women, stays relatively high, 1939 through to 1942-ish. around 1942, 1943, there's a significant change in morale, and that's partly because by this point, 420,000 German workers have been killed by Allied bombings of Germany, and that led to new strategies being put in place to ensure that enough goods were being produced to help the Germans win the war. And that included things like the decree for comprehensive deployment of men and women for Reich defence tasks, which is a long-winded way of saying basically conscription for war work, where we've got men aged 16 to 65 and women aged 17 to 45 being conscripted into war work. And that's, particularly for women, a really big turn in policy. And we've got Spears factories being run 24/7. So when you're being conscripted to work in these jobs, you could be working night shifts or day shifts or whatever it might be, whatever was considered necessary. There were also, by the end of the war, 7 million Germans, as well as 7 million people in occupied areas, doing forced labour as well. And that was under Fritz Sautel, who was put in charge of labour allocation. So the war had a significant impact on the way that workers were being treated and what was being expected of them. Like I said before, and it's worth bearing this in mind, initially 1939 to 42, although wages had been frozen, people could still get bonuses, and in actual fact, extra rations could be offered for people who had good attendance. They did use fines for absenteeism, but that was mainly sort of 1943 to 45, when the working week increased from around 51 hours to around 60 hours on average a week. And there was a ban of holiday leave from 1944. So we can see really it's towards the end of the war that workers are really significantly impacted, and there were much larger levels of absenteeism and workers' morale really was quite low. Interestingly as well, it's worth bearing in mind that the KPD, a group who you might think there would be quite a lot of resistance from and they might stir up the workers to resist the Nazis during the early war, didn't. And that's probably because the Nazi-Soviet Pact 1939 to 41 was in place, which kind of suggested that the Nazis were in some way in league with the communists, so they didn't really resist, particularly at that point. But after the Nazi-Soviet Pact is broken, with Operation Barbarossa, with the Germans going into Russia, or sorry, I should say the USSR, 89 secret cells of the KPD in Berlin restarted their opposition towards the Nazis, as you might expect. So overall, the workers' morale was relatively stable until 1942, beginning of 1943, when it really dropped quite significantly. Young people were probably next most significantly impacted by the war in terms of their morale. I mean, again, I would say 1943 is a turning point. There were groups of the youths who did oppose the Nazis during the war, which suggests that their morale wasn't particularly high. But I would say that they were limited in number. So the swing youth, for example, mostly middle class, they listened to things like jazz music and dancing. It wasn't political, they didn't really do anything huge to oppose the Nazis, which suggests that their morale obviously wasn't that low, so they weren't that impacted. The Edelweiss Pirates are a very interesting one. I'll come back to that. But the Wandervogel were law-abiding, but just a bit unconventional, as Whitfield had argued. So again, a bit like the swing youth, they didn't really pose any significant threat. They probably weren't particularly low in their morale. They just didn't like the Hitler Youth and their ways. The Edelweiss Pirates, like I said, more significant, although they're only really in the Rhineland and the Ruhr area. So again, they were limited in number. But they do prove that there were youths out there who were particularly had very low morale and didn't like the Nazi ways. They avoided conscription. They organised their own expeditions, sang band songs, not particularly significant. But in 1944, very significant, they helped army deserters, and leaders of the Edelweiss Pirates ended up being publicly hanged in 1944 as a result. So they obviously were quite disillusioned with the system that was in place during the war. The White Rose group, also very interesting group, led by Hans and Sophie Scholl. 1942 to 43 in particular were particularly active. They published 6 pamphlets on morality. They were really quite influenced by Catholic Bishop von Galen, and in particular Hans Scholl, who'd been sent out to help with the war effort before he went back to university in Berlin. He was really anti-war. He was kind of against it completely, and that was one of the things that drove him. So his morale had been really dented. Also, morale was impacted by evacuation for children. So evacuation of children from Berlin and Hamburg in particular, not all the way across Germany, but mainly those 2 cities, started from 1940. It was done as whole schools evacuated together, so hotels, guest houses, foster families were used. There's quite a lot of social pressure for people to go, and like we've mentioned already with women, 43 cities were bombed in 1943. So there were a number of young people who would have been impacted by that at home. However, actually, morale remained quite high amongst most young people. So the BDM and the Hitler Youth, the League of German Maidens and the Hitler Youth remained compulsory, but there was no conscription of young people until 1941. And even then it was only conscription of those who were 18 years and older. It's not till 1943 that 17 years old and older were conscripted into the Waffen-SS for 3-week training courses. And the Volksstern, the Home Guard, started conscripting 16-year-olds and over. All young people were expected to do things like help collect for winter aid programme, but that didn't really dent the morale in any way of young people. That's just sort of like charitable or idea, and most young people were quite happy to do that. The Hitler Youth and the League of German Maiden programmes also carried on, so things like hikes and exercise and things like that. So there's probably more of a sense of normality for lots of young people. And we know also that lots of young people were willing to help with things like gathering the harvest. So 600,000 boys and 1.4 million girls helped to do things like gathering in the harvest. So although there are some, well, in particular the White Rose and the Edelweiss Pirates, although those groups really showed evidence of really low morale amongst some particular groups of youths, overall, young people, despite evacuation and some of them being conscripted, actually most of the boys who were conscripted into the Waffen-SS and things like that, so it's quite an exciting opportunity. They didn't really understand what was going to be asked of them until they really got into the battlefields. We know that one group did actually face fighting in the Battle of Normandy in 1944 in France, but most young people actually were less impacted by the war compared to the rest of society, and their morale remained very high. The army is an interesting group to look at when we're considering morale. Certainly during Blitzkrieg, like we've mentioned before, 1939 to 41, Hitler's seen as a military genius. They're very rapidly taking over lots of areas of land. And also Operation Barbarossa as well in 1941 into 42. They're having quite a lot of success in the USSR. But obviously there's harsh winter conditions and things like that in 1941, and they start writing home and undermining propaganda that had been out there from Goebbels. But we could argue that ultimately in most wars, soldiers would consider that they would probably come across quite harsh conditions, and there's certainly no evidence of any kind of mass rebellions or mutinies or anything like that. Spring 1944, morale really does start to drop for the army, but it's really towards the end of the war there. And that's because there's a continuous retreat on the Eastern Front, and they were failing in things like their U-boat siege of Britain. They were hoping to use the U-boats, which are submarines, to kind of siege Britain and stop them from getting their supplies, like their wheat and things like that they needed for bread. But again, there's still things that kind of kept morale relatively high. So use of V1 and V2 missiles against Britain slightly increased morale. It was never going to be enough to win the war, but it meant that 1944 to 45 there were still things that the German military were involved with and doing that didn't completely break their morale. So did the Nazis succeed in keeping morale high 1939 to 45? To an extent, yes, they keep the morale relatively high up until 1943, but then really 1943 to 45, I would say they have very limited success. The main groups who were particularly badly impacted were women and workers. The elites didn't really like what was going on to begin with, whereas the armed forces and young people, except for the elite of the army, of course, were relatively still on board by the end of the war. So morale was only really succeeded in keeping high throughout the war if we look at certain groups of young people and the army. So I hope this has been helpful. Best of luck with your revision. I would highly recommend maybe replanning this evidence for perhaps a similar question, something along the lines of something like, how far do you agree that workers were the most significantly impacted by World War II in Germany, 1939 to 45. Best of luck with your revision.